this panel on gendered approaches to online violent extremism. My name's Craanen. I'm the research manager at Tech Against Terrorism. So first of all, thanks to GNET for making space for this panel. It's an incredibly important panel, an incredibly important topic, and I'm very glad that I've got such excellent panelists to discuss it with me. So before we start, I just wanted to kind of point out that what we're going to talk about and what does it actually mean to have a gender approach to countering or to violent extremism or terrorism in general. So I think whilst this might be an obvious point, I think it's very important to say that gender does not equal sex. So today we're not going to talk about women and terrorism or women being perpetrators or victims of terrorism. We might, but this is different than just saying that. So for me personally, because I think gender is, there's many different forms, many different lenses, but for me personally, it's a lens through which I understand the world, and not just violent extremism and terrorism, but through the gender lens, you can find out different realities. So when we put that in the context of violent extremism and terrorism, it brings to light different issues, different perceptions, different realities, different problems. And when we have these new perceptions, then we can come up with new solutions. And that's obviously the very important part. How do we actually bring solutions to the field of countering violent extremism and terrorism? I also want to point out that gender or feminist studies, there's many different strands and it's all very complex. And I realized this again when I read all the panelists, their excellent pieces of work, which actually take a second to read it and to really understand it because it's such a complex sort of lens to get to grips with. There's different perceptions, there's different theories, sort of brands, there's post-structuralism, constructivism. Don't worry, that's not what we're going to go on to about today. But I think it's very important before we actually start this panel to say, listen closely to the research that's being presented, but also the viewpoints and the analytical lens that is being taken when they do so. So without further ado, what we're going to talk about today, so we've got very, well, I think excellent topics. So we're going to go from a sort of what is being forgotten, so women in terrorism and violent extremism. We're going to talk about the importance of listening to targeted communities and their role in countering violent extremism and terrorism and how important that is. We're going to talk about anti-gender sentiments in the far right. And we're going to talk about violent extremist mothers or motherhood within violent extremism. So without further ado, what I'm gonna do today is I'm gonna introduce the panelists, not all in one go, but before they go on. So we'll start with Barbara. So Dr. Barbara Molas is a researcher of current and emerging threats at the International Center for Counter-Terrorism, ICCT, where she supports counter-terrorism and preventing and countering violent extremist efforts against far-right and anti-establishment threats in particular. The work she's going to talk about today is called Falling Through the Cracks, Monitoring and Misogyny in Counter-Terrorism and Preventing and Countering Violent Extremism. Barbara, the floor is yours. Thank you. Oh, I'm the first panel? It's yours. Oh, okay.
Didn't know that, sorry. Well, thank you for having me here first. I'm very glad to be in London and to be surrounded by friends and colleagues who I deeply admire and very nice people. And thanks for the very nice introduction. I really appreciate it. So yeah, today I'm going to talk about the way that we practice. So either you being a researcher or being a practitioner, the way you look at terrorism and emerging threats is really framed or dependent on the way you look at the threat landscape, which is based on essentially what you've learned, what you've studied, the type of literature you've been exposed to, how you essentially understand what matters or what we should be focusing on. And whatever you do in research, if you're a researcher and not a practitioner, that is going to inform whatever the practitioners think they should be focusing on. So I really want to stress just at the start that whatever your role is in this field, you're part of this circle where we create a knowledge exchange permanently, where our views are not only shared, but we also all participate in creating a framework that defines our research questions, the way we look at a problem, and how we reach certain conclusions. So I don't know if I'm supposed to have a click or yes, there you go, great. Yeah, okay, so yeah, I'm at ICCT. For those who are not familiar with ICCT, this is a think tank or think and do tank, as we like to call it, because we don't only conduct research, but the point is for us to conduct research that is actually useful or applicable to practitioners. We talk a lot to member states, law enforcement, social workers at any level of the prevention, countering violent extremism landscape. And we also talk to other researchers across the EU, but also beyond. And my pillar, which currently is represented solely in the company by myself and one intern. In there, what we do is essentially we try to identify what is that is new or what is that is changing in the terrorism landscape. And we do that mostly online right now and trying to study or identify the links of whatever we see online that seems to be new and their impact offline, and how can experts that are trying to identify that threat offline can really see those links and make of those things something useful to inform their practices. So we do try to identify threats, and based on that, we collect data, which includes monitoring to a limited extent, but more and more. We do analysis, tool building, and essentially produce policy briefs, even short papers like the ones that you would read on GNET that are really clear and get to the point of essentially something that someone would have time to read rather than a 30-page journal article. So we do really try to make our research useful. So the presentation is going to be, this is not reacting.
Point the clicker at Maddie is what it works for.
At Maddie.
Yeah.
That works. You got the power. Is that the first? Yeah. So those who are not familiar with what monitoring is, essentially, you observe what's out there and online specifically that seems to be harmful in terms of the dissemination of, for example, hateful content, anything that might be seen as a concern or, a radicalizing tool that might be targeting vulnerable individuals or users online, susceptible to radicalization and hate speech. So usually monitoring does only that, observe and collect data, but does not necessarily mean that there's an intervention process there. But monitoring does inform, the advice that we will be giving, for example, to law enforcement. But what's important for this presentation is to stress that when we monitor, we're looking for threats that we've agreed upon in terms of them being important. So as I was starting this conversation, what I said is we have a shared knowledge. We all participate in creating this knowledge, in creating the framework, the lenses through which we see what we think we should focus on. So flagged content, that's bias. And we have to acknowledge that. And obviously, because this panel is based on or focused on gender, what I'm going to talk about is what happens when that content and that framing of the flagged information online is gender-based biased. So there's three main slides. They're organized by flagging, reacting, and addressing, because this is usually how the process of monitoring until there's actually any impact or an intervention happens. So I hope this makes sense to you. Also, side note, I know there's a lot of words in these slides. I didn't have any great pictures to go with it, so I'm so sorry about that. For those who wish to have the PowerPoint, I'll be happy to share, so you don't have to stick your eyes on there and just try to read as much as you can. So first, we flag content. So before we even flag content, we have to define the threat. And so what happens is that most existing literature about terrorism focuses on case studies that are essentially male-dominated spaces, or on criminal justice cases that were, for example, prosecuting self-identified male individuals. So then what happens is our definition of what's threatening or what might be the cases most prone to inflicting violence offline is that we associate that with male individuals online or offline. And so I've called this totally don't use it, but Orientalism effect. I don't know if you're familiar with Edward Said. If not, you should. He talked a lot before about, the expert knowledge bubble that is created by quoting each other. So here today, a couple of people said, oh, I quoted your article in my paper. And this reminded me of well, I hope I didn't say anything, because we trust each other's expertise. So we create, again, this framework of knowledge where, it's a very safe space, but at the same time, biases that are part of it also are reproduced over time. And so 10 years from now, someone was going to tell us, oh my God, you guys said that in London that one time, and that's so wrong. But right now we don't see it, but it might happen. I'm sure it will happen. So essentially that's happened a lot with CT and PCV, the type of literature that we have access to, and the type of knowledge that we use to build upon our understanding of a threat is highly gendered. And so what's interesting, and there's been new publications on that, like Evian Lighted and Kat Tibaldi published this very interesting article on GNET about the granola Nazis that essentially really stress the fact that self-identified male individuals online express their radicalized or extremist ideas in ways that are totally different from how like a self-identified female, for example, user would express them. But that doesn't make them different in terms of one being extremist and the other not being extremist. They're both equally extremists. But why are women being dismissed is because our understanding of what is supposed to be dangerous is based on all this knowledge around male individuals and male case studies. So they fall through the cracks. What happens here is that if the way we define the threat defines the way or determines the way we see the threat being manifested, and then we use that to inform law enforcement, say, in how they're supposed to practice, then they will also be focusing on male, threats that come from male spaces or male-dominated groups. So then right away, they're just like dismissing any threats coming from female individuals. So reacting, as I was saying, essentially, what happens is that female subjects or users are dismissed or treated with leniency. So I saw this term and I was like, I can't believe this. But essentially, there's something called gender atypical and gender typical behavior. And there's been work done in it saying, violence is not, or violent behavior is not associated with female individuals because it's considered to be gender atypical. So it's men are supposed to be violent. And because what's concerning to member states primarily, or law enforcement, is violence or violent acts, then anything else is not as important, is not higher risk or of highest priority. But then obviously by doing that, they're dismissing the type of role that other individuals, female individuals, might have in shaping the terrorist landscape, because there's many ways that you can engage with extremism, and you can even create action triggers that lead to violence from your role that you attribute yourself on a gendered as well from the terrorist perspective. But then you as a practitioner or researcher trying to identify that are totally dismissing it right away. So then we're missing half the picture of how the terrorism landscape is shaped by doing that as well. It's not like we're dismissing female individuals, we're missing half the picture. So that's very important. That's why I'm repeating myself in the last 30 seconds. So finally, what's important in the reacting part is that most prosecuted individuals for terrorist offenses are male. And we have data that says that, there's not that much evidence pointing at the fact that there's no female individuals committing terrorist offenses. There's just not, the evidence is completely selected. It's also difficult to gather, obviously, like I know of researchers who've been on the field and they're like, how do you justify, if, for example, you're in a Islamic or ISIS dominated area and there's women who are supporting the state by feeding soldiers, for example, they're contributing to sustaining the state. But proving that in court is very difficult. But then just put resources to try and fix that. So if there's evidence that exists, that there's behavior that can be recorded and evidence that can be collected, then just put more investment in that. Raise awareness about the existence of that data and the fact that most of the data we have is actually androcentric, which means that it's tailored to support these cases that have been forever focused on the male individual. And finally, addressing question mark, because I don't know if we're addressing the problem too well, but we certainly are trying. So at the end of the day, the problem is that if we don't question the type of knowledge that we use to build upon our expertise, then we perpetuate gender biases. And the problem is that not only does that influence our work and the quality of our work, how effective we are at doing what we do, but it also affects our workspace. I mean, there's more and more women involved in CT and PCV, but this is rather new. So this is an opportunity, but also it means that everything that we look at, 10 years before now is going to be gender type of knowledge that we have to question. And, if we have to start over, we start over. It doesn't matter. I mean, terrorism is defined like differently 10 times a day. We can start over. It's no problem. So what's really problematic, and it really concerns me, and is that by dismissing part of the threat on the basis of gender, we're also making gender-based threats less evident to our own staff. So let's say if we inform our practices based on the idea that women are expected to express themselves in gender typical ways, how are we supposed to identify misogyny being mainstreamed? And I talk to municipalities and they're like, no, the gender problem is just not really an issue. It's not something we should focus on because it doesn't exist. And I'm like, oh my God. Sorry, but I'm like, that's just not true. And they're like, where's the evidence? I'm like, pay me and I'll find it, But then they're always questioning, should we fund this? Because it's not really a priority. So we go back to 2 slides ago when I was like, well, the priorities are defined by the case studies prior to that, which are gendered. So anyway, and even more importantly, if we prosecute more men than women on the basis of gender prejudice, we're also robbing female individuals at risk of radicalization or radicalized from the opportunities to engage and participate in, de-radicalization, rehabilitation, and reintegration programs, which is awful. And again, it doesn't address the problem, half the picture of how the terrorist landscape is being shaped. So recommendations, I mean, this is not groundbreaking. But necessary to put on the table nonetheless. So we do have to support female-led research in the CT and PCB fields of study, and not be afraid of having someone question what's been treated, as a sacred sort of text that defines our practice today, because it's not ideal or perfect anyway today. What I was saying before, invest in having evidence on the gender dynamics in, context of conflict, or in terrorist groups, extremist groups. What is that gender, the way they also see it affects the type of role that they have in, violent action, violent behavior. And again, violent behavior doesn't necessarily mean being, going out there and killing someone. It means a lot of things. And action triggers are also a thing. You could not necessarily be violent yourself, but promote violent behavior, and that would trigger someone else acting because of the way you behaved. So it's a chain that we have to better understand. So we should either improve our knowledge on that or just invest in gathering more evidence. So yeah, we need to invest in essentially raise gender, again, not groundbreaking, but gender awareness, gender sensitivity in our work. There's no support. I mean, even at ICCT, we're constantly pushing for that. We need to know more about this. And we need to start in the workspace so that then that can be reflected. And we've talked about this earlier today, but the way we perceive the world affects the way we work. So first change it at home, change it in the workspace, and you will see the data comes in a different way, that we look at literature in a different way, that we question more, that we raise the right questions, or at least more nuanced and complex questions. So that in the workspace needs to happen first, I think. So we know that police and law enforcement efforts to be constantly in touch with the community are very useful to flag threats, but I do think that women's groups should be involved and seen as key partners, because they would tell you and recognize activities that are not considered, they would not say things like, oh, that's not gender typical or atypical. They'll just flag behavior that is different and that expresses concerns to their community in a different way, coming from a totally non-expert point of view. So that could be useful. And, just circling back in, talk about it. So that's why I created this presentation, to talk about it. And hopefully we can talk about it more. And I hope I'm within the 10 minutes, probably not, but thanks for your attention.
Thanks very much, Barbara, for setting out the problem, as well as some of the solutions. So first of all, just to my panelists, so the microphone connects to the Zoom. which is why they're very useful. So I just got a note saying speak into the microphone. So you did very well. I did not, but just a note there. So now from Barbara, we're going to move to Blyth Crawford. So she's an analyst at Moonshot and a PhD student at King's College London. Her work specializes in far-right online social movements with a focus on radicalization and old tech platforms. She's also worked previously as a research fellow at the International Center for the Study of Radicalization. So today she's going to talk about anti-gender sentiment within the far right, mainly focusing on far-right attitudes to sex, feminism, and queer people, drawing on one of her ICSR pieces, which I highly recommend that you read after. So Blyth, floor is yours.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to
speak into the microphone.
Yes.
So great, thank you for the introduction, Anna. It's really lovely, and thank you to everyone at GNET for having me, and to Maddie and Nicola for organizing especially. I want to get really issue specific here and talk about sort of sex, sexuality, and anti-Semitism, and sort of interplay between these three concepts. Let's just see if this works. Oh, she's microchipped. Okay. So I'm going to talk about three main things. So I want to go over some quick definitions about familialism, cultural Marxism, which are two kind of concepts I'm going to speak about quite a lot, and then kind of draw on three main case studies. So Maddie. Yeah. There we go, thank you. So yeah, this is, as Anna said, kind of drawing on a paper that I did for ICSR last year that really speaks about kind of gender, sex, and sexuality as a key part of far and extreme right ideology. Broadly, these three things can kind of be grouped under the anti-gender movement, which is kind of this extremely broad movement, which kind of is united in this disbelief in the concept of gender, and sort of targeting people on the aspect of their sort of gender, but with this belief that there is no separation between gender and sex. It's a super broad movement. I don't want to delve into the definition too much, but there's more sort of detail in the paper if you want to look at it afterwards. This is kind of based in research which was done looking at archives of terrorist movements in Telegram, terrorist operated websites, propaganda produced by specific terrorist groups, and also manifestos and live streams from a number of extreme right attacks. There was a broad number that were looked at for this paper, but the ones that are specifically included are listed here down below. So the first thing that I want to talk about, which is kind of quite, which is like a recurring theme throughout this paper, is this idea of familialism. So I'm drawing on Andreas Kemper's definition here, and he defines this as a form of biopolitics where the traditional family is seen as like the core part of reproducing the nation, or in this case, the white race. So basically meaning that the family is center to kind of reproducing the white race. A straight cis-het man and a cis-het woman get together, they have white children, and that is how we continue the white race. Therefore, family, as defined like that, has to be the core of kind of extreme right thought and the key goal. So there are some kind of logical inferences from this. The first being that gender is exactly the same as sex. There's no sort of wiggle room between these two definitions. And secondly, that reproduction sexually is like the core of the extreme right. Like the main goal of this movement is to have white children and continue that extremely pure, they would suggest, bloodline. How this kind of melds with anti-Semitism has a lot to do with, I believe, cultural Marxism. So this is a kind of fundamentally anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that essentially runs on ideas that so-called Jewish elites occupy these deep-seated positions of control within mainly cultural institutions with a high level of influence. So kind of that stereotype that, you know, Jewish people are in control of television, banking, entertainment industries, education, and government. And this cultural influence is unfairly leveraged against white people, particularly white families. So these are the two kind of core concepts that this paper kind of delves into. And some case studies that have really kind of been foregrounded in the archives and the research I looked at is what I'm going to talk about now. So the first is anti-feminism, I think sort of the most obvious one. So there was this recurring narrative in these materials that traditional gender roles are being corrupted by feminism, which is being promoted by these institutions, so-called, there we are, so-called kind of controlled by unfair Jewish influence. So we have multiple narratives that women's sexual liberation is pushing, or well, there are degenerate lifestyles being pushed by media institutions, which are causing, you know, degeneracy through sexual liberation of women. This is not a direct quote because I garbled it, but it should have been a direct quote from the Bratislava Shooters Manifesto. where he talks a lot about anti-feminism as being pushed by Jewish control. And so this is seen as something which kind of corrupts white families, because women are seen not to be having sex for the sole purpose of reproduction, as it is framed as it should be within the extreme right. There's a lot of talk about sort of sexual immorality, lowering white birth rates, which is a really, really common recurring theme. And there's also a theme of feminism being linked with the so-called Great Replacement conspiracy theory. So the Halle shooter, who conducted an attack in 2019 in Halle, Germany, as inspired by the Christchurch shooter, he speaks about feminism being the scapegoat for mass immigration. So he talks about kind of women not wanting to have children with white men in their own countries, therefore that necessitates, you know, non-white immigration. So really linking feminism as the cause of the Great Replacement. So there's incredible amounts of kind of overlap there. And of course, this is all supposed to be influenced by Jewish people in these cultural institutions. There are a large number of just general kind of narratives about sex, one of which kind of is particularly recurrent is this anti-pornography narrative. So again, pornography is kind of framed under this anti-Semitic lens of being controlled by Jewish people. So we see in the Buffalo Shooters manifesto, he talks about pornography preventing the birth of a new generation, because white men are no longer having real world relationships, and this prevents men from, you know, bonding with people in real life, was his suggestion. It's also seen to be promoting mixed race relationships, and therefore corrupting the purity of the white family structure by, you know, being seen as kind of getting in between that sort of white, pure genetic race, which is so important to so many people in the extreme right. It's also seen as promoting white complacency, so preventing white men from, you know, taking up arms and training themselves to become physically strong to fight physically against the white replacement, because they're just sitting at home watching porn. That is a very kind of recurrent narrative within extreme right propaganda. The final point that I want to make on this very quick whistle-stop tour is anti-queer hatred, which is one of the most recurrent narratives. There are all the resources that I looked at. Queerness is sort of framed by core texts within that are sort of recurrent within this movement as being either a choice, an affliction, or a mental illness that is sort of pushed by these key cultural institutions, again, that are seen as being sort of unfairly populated by Jewish people. It's seen as kind of the ultimate corruption of traditional sex roles that are necessary to upkeep white families. So we're seeing, you know, age-old stereotypes of effeminate men and, you know, masculinized women. Queer people are also really coded as the ultimate threat to family by being a specific threat to children asexually, due to, you know, age-old queerphobic stereotypes, and also brainwashing. So the idea that you can turn a child gay by, you know, showing them a pride flag, or, you know, turning a child trans is particularly like a massive narrative right now on the extreme right. And of course, this is A, on Jewish people, and B, mostly directed towards trans women of color, who face the harshest and the highest levels of hate. So to sum that section of what I want to talk about up, essentially gender and, you know, sexuality and sex-based hate, the sort of anti-gender umbrella, is a fundamental part of extreme right hate, particularly within the Great Replacement conspiracy theory, and it's really often overlooked. There is, you know, little separation between this anti-Semitic lens and, you know, this misogynistic, queerphobic lens. And so separating these out into two distinct categories we need to fight against, you know, very distinctly, doesn't really make a lot of sense, because that's not how the extreme right is approaching this sort of thing. And I want to end on this point that this hate also isn't existing in a vacuum. We're seeing this kind of hate and this kind of sentiment really become very prevalent within mainstream discourse as well. An example of this is, you know, particularly clear right now is anti-queer sentiment, particularly anti-trans hate. We're seeing massive increases in anti-trans hate crime in the UK, US, and also beyond. Far-right protests are kind of really making their way into the mainstream. We're seeing these narratives of drag queen story times becoming, you know, a real culture war issue, so-called culture war issue. And we're seeing this kind of be a narrative that unites groups that wouldn't traditionally stand toe-to-toe with each other, like people in sort of feminist spaces. Some of them are, you know, amenable to these narratives and are attending the same protests as literal Nazis. So it's kind of a concerning spread. I just want to end, not on this slide, but on this one. This is a project that myself and my colleague in Swansea, Ninian Frangwelli, who I recommend you check out, who's a gender scholar, have been working on. It's very, very preliminary stages right now, but we've been looking at sort of transphobic slurs within far-right spaces on social media and how they might map on to mainstream events. We're looking at sort of legislation in the US and also kind of key reporting in news in the US and UK of kind of trans focused stories. And we can see that there does seem to be very preliminarily a bit of synergy between these two results, you know, where we're seeing spikes in queerphobic and transphobic events occurring or transphobic legislation coming in. We're seeing a spike within transphobic hate speech in extreme right spaces. So there is that synergy occurring. So yeah, just finally, in summary, these things are not happening in a vacuum. These are not isolated kinds of hate. Gender and sexuality-based hate are right up there with, you know, anti-Semitism and race-based hate. It isn't entirely possible. Obviously, you know, there will be peaks of certain things in like different narratives within the extreme right, but separating them completely and not tackling this kind of hate with, you know, an intersectional lens doesn't really tackle the problem, because that's not how the extreme right frames it for themselves. And so that really necessitates a lens that is fundamentally intersectional. And I will pass back to Anna with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Blyth. That was a very complex topic, well, complex topics, I would say, that you've brought real clarity to. So thank you very much. It also very much leads to our next speaker. So Anna Meier is an assistant professor of politics and international relations at the University of Nottingham, where she works on counter-terrorism and white supremacy in the United States and Western Europe. She's worked with organizations like Tech Against Terrorism, RAND Europe, and the German Federal Foreign Office, and her work is funded by the British International Studies Association. So Anna today is going to talk about the importance of listening and learning from targeted communities as sources of expertise in anti-LGBTQI+ violence. So Anna, for yours.
All right, thank you very much, Anna, for that kind introduction. I want to start with a few recent instances, that's correct, yes, of anti-queer and anti-trans violence. So the first in the upper left-hand corner is a protest outside of a drag performance in South London. The protest was organized by Turning Point UK, which is an offshoot of the US far-right group. As you can see, there was also quite the pro-LGBTQ+ counter-protest. The second is a memorial outside of Club Q nightclub in Colorado Springs, Colorado, where a bigot killed 5 people last November in the highest profile anti-queer attack in the US since Orlando in 2016. And finally, the last headline is from Ireland, an instance of schoolboys gay bashing a classmate. Some or maybe all of these moments of violence might not register to us as violent extremism, or even in the case of the protest, as violence at all. But I would wager ask any queer or trans person, and they will tell you based on their lived reality that these are all part of the same story and cannot be considered in isolation. So I speak today as a scholar of white supremacist violence and as a queer cis woman. I mention these dual identities because they inform what I'm going to call a target-centered approach to studying violence. In the context of anti-queer and anti-trans violence specifically, a target-centered approach does 3 things, which I'm going to break down in more detail in the rest of my time. First, it shifts the source of scholarly research towards local communities and marginalized groups and advocates platforming rather than extracting their knowledge. It shifts the labels that we use for violence away from the endless debates about terrorism and extremism towards structural violence of white supremacy and settler colonialism, of which what we call violent extremism is only one manifestation. And it shifts possibilities when considering policy responses towards different kinds of security and community care. So first, a target-centered approach shifts sources. To illustrate what this means, I'm going to use a few examples. So we've probably all heard cautionary advice to wait and see in the aftermath of a violent event until we learn more about the perpetrator's motives and so on. Oftentimes, I think this advice comes from a good place. It's important to take into consideration after many instances of assuming violence was perpetrated by a Muslim or a brown person. However, this urging to wait and see can also privilege elite voices and drown out the interpretations of communities directly targeted by violence. I'm thinking in particular about the Asian community in Atlanta, Georgia, who insisted the Atlanta spa shooter was anti-Asian, while experts were still calling for caution. The Moore County, North Carolina power station shootings from last November, which trans people immediately linked to anti-trans activism by accounts such as Libs of TikTok, pictured here. These links were repeatedly disregarded, again, by terrorism and extremism experts. And I'm also thinking about the Highland Park shooting in Chicago, where Jewish people knew that a Jewish neighborhood had been targeted for being Jewish, even as experts downplayed the role of anti-Semitism in the immediate aftermath. Targeted communities know when they are being targeted because that is how they survive. A target-centered approach takes their expertise seriously. Beyond the ideological context of an attack, targeted communities have other information that external academic researchers may not. In the case of the Club Q attack, it was a local drag performer who pointed out that media sources had incorrectly identified a trans woman at the club as a drag queen. This insider perspective matters because it can stop us from feeding transphobic narratives of trans women as male impersonators, however unintentional that feeding might be. A target-centered approach leads us to questions of ethics and positionality, and to productively consider whose voices are privileged when we try to make sense of violence. A target-centered approach shifts labels. To keep with the Club Q example, but also to highlight the dynamics that occur after many acts of violence. There was considerable debate, which was shaped by the US legal code, which I'm happy to answer questions about, over what to call Club Q. Was it a mass shooting? Was it violent extremism? Was it a hate crime? Was it stochastic terrorism? In queer and trans circles, the conversation over what to call Club Q looked a little bit different. Those who employed the language of terrorism did so in reference to regular, everyday acts of violence against queer and trans people. Others talked about the bounds of what is thinkable and how US culture made anti-trans and anti-queer violence far too thinkable. And others invoked the language of white supremacy directly. And these are just some of the most visible voices. I've only included things that were published in media outlets to avoid appropriating emotional reactions from people who didn't want those shared more widely. But all of these reactions from a targeted community point to, whatever language they happen to use, is larger patterns of structural violence. This is the lens through which queer and trans people often are making sense of these attacks. And that's important to take seriously, I think. When we do take it seriously, our attention shifts from debates over academic analytical categories and government labels to white supremacy, to settler colonialism, to racial capitalism, to cis heteropatriarchy, excuse me. I've included this graph from the Counting Crowds project. I'm happy to share these slides with anybody who wants them, who wants to look at the original source. It's the graph of far-right protests in the US because it shows, and these are the red bars or the slightly darker bars at the bottom. These are a small but significant number of these protests that made explicit anti-LGBTQ+ claims. And that number is growing, even though it's small. A target-centered approach teaches us, and this is really a point that Blyth made, that anti-queer and anti-trans violence is not disconnected from broader white supremacist violence. And it encourages us to consider groups and movements that we might consider as separate as, again, part of the same story. Finally, a target-centered approach shifts possibilities. I'm going to show some anti-trans news headlines. They are upsetting, even more so because they are so commonplace. So fair warning, 3, 2, 1. So this headline on top is from Ron DeSantis, who unfortunately just announced his presidential campaign in a massive dumpster fire on Twitter. In one day, Ron DeSantis signed 5 anti-trans bills restricting rights in Florida. I have family in Florida, so this affects me directly. The bills target everything from healthcare to pronoun use to school systems. And this is one instance. There are currently 530 active anti-trans bills moving through legislatures in the United States. Florida is the worst case, but it is not isolated. But this is not just a US problem, even though I think we hear a lot about the US. Keir Starmer, Labour leader in the UK, telling the Sunday Times that trans rights can't override women's rights, a statement that makes no sense because those are part and parcel of the same thing. All the way down to Czech President Zeman, who called trans people disgusting. I share these headlines because they are statements or actions in the case of DeSantis made by sitting politicians, and in some cases heads of state. However well-intentioned individual bureaucrats or policymakers might be, It is hard to take state claims of protecting queer and trans people seriously when these positions are so commonplace. A target-centered approach would encourage us to look beyond the state, to target communities themselves as sources for our quote unquote impact, to use a UK research word that I hate. This is not a new idea. I do want to make that clear. The concept of we keep us safe is central in queer and trans communities who have been failed time and time again by the state, often by design. The phrase actually comes out of abolitionist work and suggests that those of us researching anti-queer and anti-trans violence need to also consider whether our research helps local and grassroots groups do their work. A target-centered approach above all else makes us constantly reflect on who our research is for. So I've considered this approach today, just to wrap up, in the context of anti-queer and anti-trans violence, but the logic, I think, also transfers to anti-Black violence, Islamophobic violence, anti-migrant violence, and every combination of those things, and so on, in productive ways. A final caveat I'd offer, and sort of a jumping off point for conversation, is that there's a difference, I think, between centering targets and co-opting them. Our desire to do research cannot trump the safety of already vulnerable communities. Academic insights are never worth re-traumatizing people, ever. The final thing I think a target-centered approach offers us is a chance to reflect on what research can be and when it is appropriate for us as external researchers to step back. So thank you all for your attention. I really look forward to the conversation.
Thanks very much, Anna. And I also highly recommend checking out the GNET piece that Anna wrote. It is very personal and touching, I would say. So thank you very much for adding that into the article. So of course, this is the moment when my laptop decides to log out, but we're back in. For the final presentation, so I do believe that Yevon is online. Excellent. I can see her. Hi, Yevon. Yevon and Jordan are going to present this next presentation, but also this piece was co-authored also by Millie Creasy's. So also pointing that out. So Yevon is a graduate student at Georgetown University studying digital extremist communities. Prior to her master's program, Yevon worked at Moonshot, the Global Internet Forum to Counter-Terrorism, GNET, amongst others. Her work primarily centers around how extremist groups conceptualize and perform race and gender, specifically in Christian nationalist and male supremacist circles. Jordan is a recent graduate of master's students at King's College London in International Conflict Studies. She attended the Emory University, double majoring in International Studies and Art History. Between her studies, she worked as a political staffer and consultant in Atlanta for both local and federal level organizations and campaigns. She has an interest in studying the intersection of women, race, and the far right in the context of violent extremism and terrorism studies. Today, they're going to talk about a largely unexplored topic of mothers and extremist mothers online. So I'll pass over the floor to you.
Hi, we don't have a PowerPoint, so you guys just get to look at our faces. When Miley, Yevon, and I came up with the concept for this article, we really wanted to look at momfluencers, or women who are influencers who are also mothers. And we wanted to look at how they participate in their various ideologies and use their roles to actually advance those ideologies. And so we specifically looked at white Christian supremacy, but also at Islamist extremism. And I think we've all kind of been agreed that it's not controversial to say that the study of women is under-researched in this field. But at the end of the day, it's changed a little bit, but there's a gap when you look at the digital landscape specifically. Mothers are often seen as people who have to raise the next generation, but what happens when mothers actually are the people who are radicalized themselves? And both Islamist and white supremacist ideologies weaponize motherhood. And we wanted to look at what happens when people monetize that and use their reach to actually expand those ideologies and bring others into it. So our paper looked at the impact of online communities. Then we did a case study on white Christian supremacy and Islamist extremism. So parenting is isolating. We all can probably agree if you have kids. I don't have kids, but I have friends who do. And while people always have good intentions, it's not easy, especially for women, to find places where people agree with them, where people are wanting to help them out a little bit. So people look online, think Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, Instagram, and eventually they move into further alt-right spaces, or not alt-right, but just alternate technologies like Gab, Telegram, Tech Haven. And Influencer and content creators are often used synonymously. They're people who can use content for social media, but they're monetizing it and just building their reach off of it. Momfluencers and mommy bloggers draw on their identities to sell these products, to bring people into their fold and widen their networks. But when you bring in extremism, those people are actually using it to exploit people and bring them into extremist ideologies. I want to make a caveat. This is not all the content that's shared as extremist. It's not, we know that. But we do know that tech platforms will sometimes send people down rabbit holes. And we wanted to look at the masks that period culture has and how the language of faith, family values, and other banal aesthetics mask purity culture and other various things that are very dangerous. So both Islamist and white supremacist communities, mothers are facilitators of their ideologies. And in some instances, they're the memory makers. They're the people who bring kids up, and they're divine people who are necessary. And complementarianism is a key piece of these ideologies, where women have this all-encompassing identity, where women are mothers and that's their primary role in society. And we're going to discuss how in Islamist and white Christian supremacists, these manifest in different ways. So when you're looking at white Christian supremacy, there's two parts to this. There's kind of the traditionalist space, but there's also the more country mom space. And so when we're looking at the traditionalist space, white supremacist mothers often engage with their identities to depoliticize and really peel back what people think of as extremist ideologies, kind of softening everything up and cloaking their languages of exclusion and violence under the cloak of protecting white family autonomy and parental rights. As we've all kind of talked about, we see that a lot in Florida, where people are weaponizing anti-LGBTQ and anti-trans sentiments under the guise of protecting children. And that's something that most people can get on with, but at the same time, there's an underlying current there. And concurrently, white supremacist mothers also imply a rhetorical tactic that Mathis calls alt-maternalism, which presents traditional mothering roles as natural, good, and empowering. And as they become more radicalized, they also become more organized. And so that's how you end up with all these movements that you're seeing in the US and here, where people are coming together and organizing. And as Blyth was talking about, or Blyth and Anna were talking about, going and hanging out with Nazis. And as we're looking at the second part, which is country moms are people who identify as people who are willing to go against the grain for what's best for their child. And this can range from anything, you've probably heard about it. It can be going for certain types of schools, certain types of beds, but it can also be anti-vaxxer sentiments. It can also be relying on homeopathic methods like essential oils to make their kids feel better when they're sick. And we can say marginalize, but also just discredit these women by calling them crazy or eccentric rather than listening to their grievances about society. And just as young boys are looking for groups where they're trying to identify with themselves on the far right or in Islamist groups, these mothers are also trying to do the same when it comes to protecting their children and doing what's best for them. I am done with my tangent, but we often make fun of crunchy moms or sad beige babies, but those spaces really, in the aesthetic of it, acts as a manifestation for far right utopian propaganda that emphasizes purity and tradition, which is not just framed through eliminating chemicals, but also through traditions that underlie the Great Replacement theory with the New World Order and everything that we can see about building families. And I'll be clear that not all country moms are far-right extremists, but the presence of these ideologies in the broader space should really be explored more to investigate how women weaponize femininity and innocence to push dangerous ideas. And it's never a sudden shift, it's always very gradual, but we can acknowledge that while these aesthetics themselves are not extremist, we have to be mindful how they're leveraged by extremist mothers and by extremist momfluencers to disseminate conspiracy theories in the name of protecting children and monetizing other parents' concerns and insecurities. And I'll pass it over to Evan.
Hi, I know we're 3 years into the pandemic, but can everyone hear me?
Yes, we're all good.
Amazing. Okay, so I'm going to go really quickly into the Islamist element. That was Meili's kind of realm. I hope I can do her some justice, as well as round off on some recommendations and final thoughts stemming and further kind of expanding on our piece. So in the Islamist community, as with many other religious extremist communities, some of which Jordan just shared, we looked specifically at the Islamic State, and messaging on womanhood places heavy emphasis on very rigid gender societal roles. As you can imagine, it's cis as well as hetero. Gender and sex isn't differentiated. Womanhood is understood as motherhood. Spousal duties to their husbands are underscored, and homemaking, which includes child rearing, are key religious obligations. For example, when we look at official propaganda like Dabiq, Rumiyah, or Al-Naba, IS instruct women to, support their husbands, guard their own modesty, and ultimately be the teacher of the generation and producer of men. So despite very stringent offline environments that dictate strictly what womanhood is and what women should be doing and how they ought to conduct themselves, the internet offers opportunities for female IS members to directly promote their own accounts about life in IS territory and carefully constructed pro-IS narratives to large public audiences. And this is important to note because they might not be making a lot of money the way that a white Christian supremacist Instagram influencer might, which might factor into the types of behaviors and content that they post. But the influence is still felt. So we felt that it was important to include them in our research. Their message is often sought to recruit other women by encouraging them to travel to the caliphate or support the IS causes other ways, even after IS has since lost a lot of its territory at its height. And much of the content remains focused on very gendered narratives that incorporate victimhood framing for women and fundraise for women and children in camps of Eastern Syria. And it's important to state that the ongoing fundraising efforts are often self-initiated by these pro-IS women. So in terms of online communications, female IS supporters, including individuals who are in the camp, outside the camps, have created chats on Telegram, Instagram, Facebook, among other myriad of platforms, where they communicate in private and public to advance these goals. So to leave you with two thoughts, the first is that we must continue building on existing research on the role of motherhood in sustaining extremist groups. This is particularly important in the digital sphere as influencer market and social norms introduce a whole new slew of cultural markers and new communication avenues that are not always taken into account when we study motherhood, and women in offline environments. And at the same time, increasing digital literacy or improving content moderation measures, which happen concurrently, researchers should acknowledge and further study the diverse ways these extremist influencers deliberately reproduce their mothering role over many other intersecting identities. Scholars like Kat Tabaldi, as well as Evian Leidig, have really led the charge here with mother influencers. I would highly recommend their GNET pieces as well as Evian Leidig's new book. So this is not new. It's definitely burgeoning and growing, but already scholars are starting to realize that this is communicated slightly differently, and that introduces new concepts as well as complications we need to take into account. And then the second point is we need more research on how women and mothers are in extremist spaces in all of their diversity. So what I mean by this is introducing granularity to how different labels that scholars have assigned to women extremists, like the propagandist label, are actually understood by different extremist women differently. So for example, what does recruitment look like to them, right? Is recruitment something that they deliberately strategize for to hit an X number of new recruits? Is that what success means to them as a propagandist, as scholars may call them? Or is their goal to raise general awareness about their hateful ideology and gain more sympathizers in the mainstream? We saw evidence of both and more motivations in our research. So while acknowledging that misogynistic forces do coerce and victimize women in these spaces, sometimes we also know that women exercise considerable agency and demonstrate diverse motivations in their extremist behaviors. With both acknowledgements, we believe that studying extremist digital momfluencers or mother influencers, I prefer it, provide a really interesting opportunity to add more nuance and complications to how we understand, and as our previous speakers have said, how we understand the problem completely changes and impacts how we collect data, where we collect data, and how we center certain kinds of data. So I hope that this will also complicate how we study extremist women more broadly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emma, and thank you so much, Jordan, especially highlighting the importance of granularity, which is a hard word for me as a Dutch person, which I think all the panelists have really done very well. So I'll pass it on to the Q&A. So let's start with some questions from the audience. Maddie, if you wouldn't mind running around with the mic in. What I'm going to try and do is take one question at a time, which hopefully Maddie will agree to help with. So any hands from the audience? I see a hand over there. Oh, we'll just pass the mic to you. And if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and then asking the question.
Hello, my name is Vic. I'm an intern with ICSR, and I am trans and non-binary myself. So Blyth and Anna's presentations were very and they were very refreshing to see, and I am glad to be to have an opportunity to speak at this, and of course, me being a trans myself, I know things that like other people may be outside of peer circles may not be privy to, so I will try to speak in relatively baby terms. So my question is, so as with other spaces, trans people also exist on 4chan, and these people specifically, they, as with other parts of 4chan, they have this reactionary view of society, and specifically, whereas the mainstream trans goal is for diversity and inclusion. These trans people on 4chan, they specifically push for isolation and just the like they're willing to reveal other people's trans identity even when it's dangerous for them, or introduce other people to the idea of transvestigation, which is a conspiracy theory that everyone else is trans, and they're just unwilling to tell you. And yeah, my question, I guess, would be that what could be done to thwart these kinds of factors, and yeah.
Thank you very much for that very important question. Anna, would you like to start?
Sure. Thank you, Vic, for the question. Of course, no community is a monolith, and there's going to be a variety of viewpoints, even within the trans community, even though that may not make a lot of sense to those of us who are on the outside of that community. Your question was, what can be done about this? I'm not a policymaker, and I'm not going to pretend to have solutions. This is a complicated question. However, what I will say is that I would wager that trans people and any marginalized group that expresses reactionary viewpoints all the way towards forcibly outing other people and embracing conspiracy theories might be less likely to do so in a less transphobic society. And so attention to the permissive context, to go back to a point that was raised on a much earlier panel by Munira, is really important, I think, for understanding why people are engaging in what you might think of as reactionary or backlash to progressive movements and such. So greater attention to context, I think, would be the very broad and unspecific recommendation that I would make.
Yeah, I don't know if I have much else to add to Anna's answer, as it was pretty much what I was thinking when we were listening to that question, was just kind of looking at the context and, working towards a society that is more sort of inclusive of the broader kind of queer community, even though at times nowadays that seems like a pretty tough challenge. Something that I can speak of a little bit is kind of this 4chan more broadly, and sort of this idea that even 4chan is not a monolith. We think about this as like this just cesspit of Nazis, but we do see different kinds of reactionary communities within 4chan itself, and we do see spaces within 4chan that are pretty queer inclusive and are sort of the opposite of what Vic was bringing up as well, sort of places that are more inclusive and good places for queer people to express and explore their communities. So just sort of building off that, that raises questions for how we want to moderate, or if we do want to moderate 4chan or stuff like that. But yeah, not much to add. I think Anna's answer was excellent.
Then we can go to the next question. Maddie's already marching, so we'll let Maddie choose.
Yeah, Inga Trautig, I'm the head of research of the Propaganda Research Lab. We're based at the University of Texas at Austin. First thing, brilliant panel, thank you so much. Second thing, thank you for mentioning Florida and not Texas too much. I didn't appreciate that. But
Texas
obviously
also bad, just to be clear.
in case anyone was in doubt. So we are doing at the lab, we started a lot of work on anti-abortion influences, bordering to extremism, etc. So I want to keep the question broad, like maybe Jordan, Blyth, Anna the most, but obviously also Barbara, if you have something to add, like how does anti-abortion activism, extremism, factor into the research that you have done?
Thank you very much, Inga. Jordan, would you like to start?
I can. So in regards to your question, it's a really big part, especially in the white supremacy section of it, because at the end of the day, I'm American, if you can't tell. When I look at the US and just see everything that's happening, and when I look at anti-abortion laws, I realize that they're not designed to impact people of color. They're designed to impact specifically white women, because white women are not having as many babies, because people are peddling anti-immigrant discourse about how people are coming in to take your jobs. And we saw it with Trump. We see it with, unfortunately, the governor of Texas, the governor of Florida, governor of Georgia. They all do it. And when you come in and you see that they're not inherently targeting people of color, they're targeting white people because they want white people to have more babies. And it kind of backfires because, as we've all been talking about, people are having interracial relationships, and abortion's not going to stop that. And that's not going to really create more white babies, unfortunately. In the discourse of influencing, like I've seen on TikToks, especially an uptick on women who are Mormons, who are very against abortion. I've seen an uptick, but sometimes you can't really tell that they're Mormons until you really deep dive into it. And so people have gotten really good at hiding that Christian face of it, but then pushing the family side of the influencer market. And so one of the things that I look at, especially with a lot of family TikToks, TikTok is unfortunately where I spend a lot of my time. I see a lot of people who are pushing anti-abortion sentiments, but unintentionally so. People who are doing it through the lens of trying to push, you should have more babies. We want more kids. We want to have 3 or 4 or 5, 7 kids. But people don't talk about how expensive that is. People don't talk about how hard that is on the kids. And I think I'm just going to try to circle back to it eventually, but in the larger scope of it, people have gotten really good at pushing anti-abortion messaging subtly. People aren't just coming right at it anymore, and because it doesn't land well. It just creates more division. And so people have found better ways at really utilizing, influencing people to have more kids and have bigger families and be on the land and do the whole thing, the white picket fence with a dog and 3 kids. And I think it takes a lot of willpower to really see through those lenses that people have gotten really good at putting in place, if that answered your question.
Thanks, Jordan. Any additional?
I don't know if this is, you'll hear me anyway. Yeah, thanks for the question. Very interesting. What I've seen increase, especially since COVID, is the anti-pill narrative among white supremacist circles. And related to a couple of conspiracy theories, but primarily the Great Replacement and the pandemic. So from saying that COVID-19 has an impact on fertility, and so don't take it, don't trust the government because it's part of their plan to gradually replace, or so all of it is connected, obviously meta narratives, but because their goal is to gradually replace our white communities with immigrant communities that are, that they're moving from, refugee waves to like scholarships, anything to like push ethnic nationals away. And really saying, there's a planned reduction of the birth rate for the white race. And so what you have to do is like, don't take the vaccine, don't take the pill, and contribute to the community, because this is how we resist. And also using a lot of the guilt part of things. So saying, well, if we talk about abortion, like, are you gonna, there's evidence that after a couple of weeks, it's a human. And so how would you do that to your own people? And so from, the moment conception happens, associating that to like protecting your people more collectively and talking about who the people are and why it's important that you actively contribute by having babies. So really a very toxic narrative. And what's interesting to me is how they link that to liberal values. So liberal values about the liberalization of women, or women having more freedom, means, and is also like part of this plan, means that women will choose not to have the amount of children that they should have, not to be at home enough to take care of the children, maybe not have children at all. So all of this really can connect to the new anti-establishment sentiment that we all talk about, that we haven't even brought up today, which I'm very surprised, but connected to all of these conspiracy narratives and far-right values, all of these intersectional ideologies that we've seen connected to that notion as well.
Oh, sorry, please.
Oh, no. I'll put it together. Devin, do you want to? Sorry, I thought you came from the audience, but you came from behind me. Go for
No
it.
worries. I'll be very quick. I think I see the other side that Jordan sees. So Jordan was talking about how people might not, even if they are not explicitly hiding it, soften the Christian element that might be influencing their anti-abortion views. The spaces that I inhabit, or rather observe, in my research, are actually people who are very gung-ho about that element. The extreme Christian right in the US is incredibly powerful and well organized online, offline, and they have a very long history of doing this work, stretching back to the 70s, and actually a lot of scholars are saying before that as well. So a lot of that ideological tradition very much is influencing anti-abortion discussions online. And in those spaces, I've seen Christianity being brought down very forcefully. This is what it means to be a good mother. This is how you not sin. And to go back to some of the things that people have shown in their slides, as well as talked about just now, it's really interesting how science is used in the conversation. Like, this is when there is a heartbeat. Science says this is when they're a human, even though actual medical authorities would complicate that knowledge a lot further and say that actually is very a moral issue. It's really much a thing that people disagree on. It's not about like when is a human or not. But there are definitely elements in the US where the Christian religious element is definitely very evident. And even though a lot of the messaging seems to be towards women to encourage them to have more children, and that's how abortion is kind of, the anti-abortion element is framed, that kind of care in a really perverted way isn't extended to women of color. Forced sterilization, unknown sterilization, as well as promoting abortion in other terms, are very much prevalent against or targeting women of color. So I think there is that imbalance to be had, and it kind of, I think, demonstrates how Christian supremacist and white supremacist structures, like Anna said, are very much present, and that just informs the discussions that we have and the people who get targeted for it.
Thank you, Yevon. And whenever you want to interject, just start speaking because I can't see you. Please do so. Blyth, do you want to add?
Yeah, just very briefly, just because speaking about familialism, anti-abortion kind of extremism and activism is very much a big part of this, and the overlap with anti-Semitism is again huge. So again, sort of seeing abortion being pushed as this like cultural influence to affect white people is very much a narrative that occurs in the extreme right spaces. And obviously the people who face the brunt of hate centered around familialism are women, and this is just an extension of that. And also just to very quickly echo something that Yevon was saying, most of my work does focus on sort of darker spaces where, you know, people are very openly extremist and more sort of atheist extremist, as in not atheist extremist, but, you know, not Christian or religious. And there is very open kind of calling for use of abortion as, you know, racial control. So, you know, something that should be used targeted against non-white people in order to continue the white race. So anti-abortion, yes, but, you know, under very specific racial circumstances, it's, you know, there in these spaces, it's much less about protecting life and much more about protecting white life. It's just very open.
Thank you, Blyth. I see a question here at the front.
Thanks, and thanks to everyone on the panel. That was really so interesting. My question's for Anna mainly, about community-led responses. Of course, communities are not monolithic. And so within communities, there is a huge amount of diversity of opinion. And what I've seen in my community over a number of years is people who are external to that community deciding which voices they should be listening to among those competing inter-community voices, and often prioritizing ones that are really not representative of the whole community. And also those who are representing the community don't always get it right because they're not always based in data, in research, in this kind of deep subject matter expertise, even when they are the community representatives. So my first question is, how do we make sure we are we are listening to the right people if we're listening to communities? And secondly, how do we balance that with subject matter expertise and knowledge basis and research at the same time?
It's quite the question for you, Anna.
I'll do what I can.
Are you ready?
I'll do what I can. Thank you, Hannah. Okay, so as we know, marginalized communities aren't monoliths. Who do we listen to? How do we make sure we're listening to the quote unquote right people? So I would say two things on the first part of your question. One, figuring this out, getting it quote unquote right, requires embeddedness. I hesitate to trust work by people who have never talked to members, say, of a queer community, and beyond that, have not spent much time in queer spaces. Because if you don't do that, then it's going to be exactly like you said, you're going to get the loudest voices, who are not always the most representative voices, not always the people with the most in-depth knowledge, which is not useful for formulating responses. The other thing I'll say is that in terms of who we listen to, I think that as a general rule of thumb, listening to the most vulnerable members of those communities, which in the context that I'm thinking about would be Black, trans, women of color, largely. Like if we work to improve social structures for the most marginalized, that improves things for everyone. And so starting there is always a good thing to point out. The point about subject matter expertise, which I think is interesting, and I'm gonna be a little unfair and turn it around as a bit of a provocation to the room, is there's an embedded question in this of what counts as expertise. And that's not to say that every single member of a queer community is an expert on everything that happens to everyone in the queer community, because like there are many queer communities. That's an unrealistic expectation. At the same time, I don't know that being a queer person for several decades and spending time in that space gives somebody any less authority than somebody who went and did a PhD on the subject. There are different kinds of skills and different kinds of knowledge to bring to bear. And so perhaps the question is not either or, but how together.
Excellent answer. Right, I will ask an online question before we pass it over to the audience again. I think Barbara, you can take a shot at this first. So from Zikri Dean from Malaysia, I hope I pronounced your name all right there. I apologize if I didn't. Based on experiences and insights, what are the most effective strategies or interventions to counter women's radicalization? How can governments, civil society organizations, and communities collaborate to provide alternative narratives, support networks, and opportunities for disengagement and rehabilitation? A great question. Thank you very much for asking it, Barbara.
Thanks. I mean, it's a key question, and I think it's a matter of increasing the presence of women in every single aspect of the sector. So as I said before, it's something that is already changing. So we see new data coming out clearly, which means that we're looking at a threat differently already. But I do think that we don't only need to rely on women who are so-called experts in the field, but also women on the ground. So that's why one of my suggestions was like for law enforcement, for example, try to have law enforcement and practitioners, social workers really be in touch with communities and groups that are centered around the way women feel in their communities, in their context, because no one knows better than them what the push and pull factors would be in a context where there's individuals who might be vulnerable to radicalization. So presence is key. And obviously, as we said at the beginning, gender doesn't mean sex. So anyone who's become vulnerable on a gender basis needs to have a presence in every single aspect of the sector as well. It's exactly the same. And it's a matter of redefining the way we practice based on that. Thanks.
Thank you, Barbara. Anything to add? No. The one thing I would say is to kind of echo Barbara's work as a Dutch person myself, and having studied women in terrorism and women foreign fighters that travel to Syria from the Netherlands. What is often seen as a source during prosecutions is one expert that says, well, actually, women can't fight on the battlefield, so therefore they can't be violent. And in order to be prosecuted for recruitment, you need to be able to recruit someone who can be violent. Ergo, basically, if you recruit women, it's not a crime.
Yeah.
And these kind of, it's one point of data, one point of evidence that led to the no prosecution. And the men went to prison, and the women that recruited the 2 men and the 3 women lived freely. So I think those are very important aspects to consider as well. Where are you getting your expertise from? Who are you listening to?
And actually this links to the last part of the question, which I totally forgot about, which is like, how do we better engage these women into programs of rehabilitation, de-radicalization, et cetera? And it goes back to what type of data we collect. So if we have the right data, then we will have enough proof in court to actually engage with these women in a space that they can not only, be rehabilitated, but also be in communication with those who can actually help. Because I mean, the context is very crucial. Like, how did they end up engaging in terrorism? And are they victims? Are they perpetrators? What's the deal? We need the data for that. So research questions need to change. Yeah.
Thank you, Barbara. Any more questions from the audience? I see a hand over there for is Maddie. Maddie, sorry. Oh, there's the mic in the back. No.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for the panelists. It was a great presentations. I'm Sri. I'm from National Counter-Terrorism Agency of Indonesia. So my question is, especially in the region of Southeast Asia and Indonesia, there is a growing trend of the involvement of the women, not just become a supporter, but become preparators. So, so they're really involved in the terrorist act. The data show that from 2011 until 2015, we just arrest like 3 females. And then from 2016 until 2021, we arrest like 40 females. That's like a huge growing of trend. And then one of the causes is that, I'm sorry. One of the causes is that the role of social media, because one of the latest case is that there's a 25 years old female, and then get radicalized from the internet, and then go to the national police headquarters, and then try to shoot the police there. So it's just become radicalized from the social media, and then not affiliate to any group. So my question is that I just wonder, like, because if we want to make a policy, we have to make a research-based policy. So is there any research to provide the shift of the role of the woman from supporter to become to really go to the battle, to become a preparator? So I just wonder about, is there any research to provide this phenomena? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that question. Do the panelists want to jump in here?
Well, I mean, I'm going to echo Yobin and promote Evian's upcoming book. I mean, I think that is groundbreaking work. I mean, there's a lot of small pieces on the role of, and also Joanna Cook has done a lot of research on that as well, looking at jihadism rather than the far right. But I would say these two women have really spearheaded the way to collect data that is useful to inform policy across the board, really not looking, it's research that is trying to be as global as it gets, really transnational, looking at the problem across the border. So I would recommend those two, yes.
I would also recommend Sarah Parkinson's work, which is specifically in the Lebanese context. So I don't know how much it would transfer, but for a really ethnographically grounded approach on why women pursue different roles in certain contexts, whether they pursue support roles or more active fighting roles, I think is very helpful.
I would, sorry.
Yeah, go for it, Evan.
I would also add that, so I'm from Singapore, Southeast Asia. The role of violent extremism in Southeast Asia is something that is personal to me. And something that I've found interesting as well as a little bit worrying is that even within the same, let's say, ideology, so Islamist extremism, a lot of times we take the literature that has been most studied and we try to apply that in a very regional, localized context. So if we're looking at IS in Syria at literally the height of their territorial expansion and say that what we observed with the women in these groups, whether they were being recruited or already there, and trying to apply that directly in Southeast Asia, well, there are completely different government pressures. There are different counterterrorism measures. There are different cultural factors that push or pull people away, as much as I don't really love that analogy, like if we're using the language that the government responds to. Those are all incredibly different and regional, even within the same group, so let's say IS, or the same ideology. So I know this conversation has been happening for about 20 years in the region now, and that Indonesia has been highly concerned about that issue. There are probably activists as well as local scholars who have been researching this work and may have data. So as much as I encourage learning from not just the same ideology, but different groups and trying to find universal factors that bring women into it, I would also highly recommend that you find local experts as well as local community members who can speak more regionally. Finding both the universal and the specific is really important in finding good policy. And I think sometimes in the non-Western world, which I hail from, we just say like, that's the best research, so we're just going to take it and we're going to force it into our context. And from places where I'm from, that has not always worked out particularly well. So I just caution that.
Thanks very much, Evan. Any? No, good. Right, so I think I'll start wrapping up to give us a bit of a break before the next session. Before I start thanking the panelists, I think what they've really shown is that this research is very personal. Identity really comes out in this. And I would say that sometimes this sector or this industry, that's very important to keep in mind. As Anna kind of alluded to, it can be more riskier for women, for people who identify as LGBTQI+, for trans, for queer, for people and women of color to do this work, because they are at a greater risk of actually being targeted by the people we study. And if we're at a greater risk, then there's going to be greater trauma, because we're going to have to look at it. And if you constantly have to be afraid that you will be targeted, then obviously there's going to be a risk there. So what I kind of want to give to the audience is to really question your own identity and how it fits in with other identities, and keeping that intersectionality at the heart of what you do. You can help amplify voices in a way that really respects the risks that all of us face. But it's important to not think, well, I'm going to protect women and help and amplify their research, but you have to talk to them, because they will have their personal preferences in terms of how that work will then be shared. And in this industry, I think that's sometimes forgotten, and it can still be quite a challenging industry to step into when you have such an identity. So I think I want to ask, and I wanted to hopefully give that as what Aaron Selva would say as homework, to really say, like, who do you amplify? Who do you retweet? Which events do you go to? Whose work do you know? And how can you actually go beyond that? How can you broaden your horizons a bit? Because I think that really is the only way to go to a more equitable field that respects diversity and equality. And I really have to give a shout out to Nicola, who stood up for it. So that's great. Well timed. As well as Maddie, for really truly organizing an inclusive conference that has not really, well, it hasn't added women or people of color or people who identify as trans or queer. Tokenistically, it has been an incredibly inclusive conference, and I think that really goes to show that we can change it, but we'll all have to do it together. So thank you, and please give it up for the excellent panel.